And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever more acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today we honor, remember, and celebrate St. George, our patron. He was a soldier who, by legend, as we heard, slayed a dragon to save a village. By tradition, he served in the Roman army in the time of Emperor Diocletian. And while we don't know when he was born, he is said to have died on April 23rd in the year 303 as a martyr. Earlier that year, on February 23rd, Emperor Diocletian brought in the first edict of what would become known as the Great Persecution. It was the last and the most severe of the persecutions of Christians in the Roman Empire. In the years leading up to it, Diocletian had already brought in policies limiting the practice of Christianity, particularly in the army. Military commanders were directed that the entire army had to make sacrifice to the designated Roman gods or face discharge. It was a harsh requirement that meant a soldier would lose his career in the military, his state pension, and his personal savings. It fell short, however, of being fatal until that too changed a few years later, in 303. St. George is part of a group of saints known for their military service, their sacrifice, and their courage. They were the soldiers who were tortured and killed for refusing to renounce their faith by offering sacrifice to the gods or engaging in other cult rituals of loyalty to the emperor. The veneration of George and all the military saints rose in prominence in the medieval period, particularly in relationship with the Crusades in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. The legend we heard of a saint slaying a dragon to rescue a princess has actually pre-Christian origins, was attributed to a variety of saints until it really stuck as a story about George in the 11th century, the same time period as the beginning of the Crusades. I really think the history here matters, as history so often does. Not so much in terms of the dragon slaying legend, but in terms of the origin of the military saints, including our patron George. It matters in particular because of what happened next. The origin of George's sainthood, his martyrdom, was defined by a time of great persecution when practicing Christianity was illegal and the saints were killed for refusing to renounce their faith. They literally followed in Christ's footsteps, choosing God's way of suffering and death. Circumstances changed, however, when Christianity became the religion of the land under the Roman Emperor Constantine, less than a generation later. Everything changed. Christians went from being persecuted to being accepted to being dominant. Fast forward several hundred years, and we get to the series of military conquests known as the Crusades, and then, of course, the colonial domination of lands and people outside of Europe, justified, as we have been learning, by the doctrine of discovery. The veneration of military saints in the context of these past roughly 1,000 years means something very different than it does with the origin stories. And to me, it means something much more troublesome and uncomfortable. In medieval times, dragons were often used to represent evil. The devil is likened to a dragon because he is the worst of all serpents, some literature describes. It also suggests that when a dragon is drawn from its hole into the air, it stirs up the air and makes it shine. In the same way, the devil makes himself appear as the angel of light to deceive the foolish. The distinction between good and evil, what constitutes those things, changes with different people in different times and circumstances. In the time of the Crusades, reconquering Jerusalem, including murdering whole populations of non-Christians, was considered holy. They were holy wars, fought against the forces of evil and darkness. The same could be said for the entire worldwide colonial project. We were bringing the light of the gospel to dark lands, with force as necessary. So the story was told. Thankfully, we have a different perspective now. And at our best, we strive to hear more diverse truths, to take responsibility for past wrongs from which we continue to benefit, and to work towards reconciliation. So much of that work remains. Put on the whole armor of God, the apostle writes to the Ephesians Christians. Put on the whole armor of God so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. The devil, like a dragon, can stir up the air to make it shine, tricking us into thinking evil is good and good evil. The wiles of the devil trick us into believing that conquest is justified. The military imagery of defending against persecution, fighting for justice for the oppressed, is really too easily twisted to our advantage. If our patron George is a model of a perfect Christian warrior, what forces of sin, ignorance, fear, and injustice does his example call us to slay now? What dragons do we need to slay? In the legend of St. George and the dragon decimates a village by consuming its life, trinkets, livestock, and finally the people, beginning with the smallest. Perhaps the dragon we need to slay now remains at its core the same as it's always been, the insatiable desire to consume, the insatiable desire for more power, more money, more young families, more volunteers, more good feelings, more everything and anything. The military imagery that we hear today is counteracted in a strange way to me by our gospel reading. Denying ourselves, taking up our crosses and following Jesus doesn't mean pretending as though desire doesn't exist. We can't deny what we don't acknowledge. Denying ourselves, taking up a cross, means choosing to walk Jesus' way of courageous, sacrificial love, the way George did. It means letting go of being a victim. As Christians, we haven't been for a very long time. And instead fighting for the truth and righteousness that brings lasting peace, come what may. It means standing firm against all the dragons that promise us the whole world while stealing our very lives. For when we lose our lives for the sake of the gospel, then we know salvation.